Jonathan, a black laborer, faces the brutality of a racist foreman who decides to go to extreme measures, pushing him from the heights of a construction site. But just moments later, something unexpected happens that turns the situation upside down. Subscribe and share where you watch this video from. The noise of the construction site was constant and unyielding, a chaotic symphony of grinding machinery, hammer strikes, and shouting voices echoing from every direction. From the upper floors to the dusty ground level, men labored with urgency and precision, knowing that one misstep could mean injury or worse. In this world of steel beams, concrete, and endless piles of raw materials, there was no place for hesitation. Jonathan adjusted his hard hat and wiped a streak of sweat from his brow, his gaze fixed on the partially finished skeleton of what would soon be a high-rise. Every day, he stood among these unfinished structures, not just working to complete them, but, in a sense, trying to build a future for himself and his family. He moved with an assuredness that came only from years on the job, carrying with him a quiet determination that was as much a part of him as his worn work boots. At 45, Jonathan had spent the better part of his life in manual labor. It was an honest living, but far from easy, and as the years wore on, the strain on his body became a little more apparent. Still, he was known as one of the most reliable workers on the site. His colleagues respected him, and his foreman rarely questioned his commitment. To Jonathan, it was more than a job. It was a duty, a commitment to provide for his family, his wife, and his young daughter, Mia. Every morning as he left the cramped apartment he shared with his family, Mia's small voice echoed in his mind. She was 7, bright-eyed and filled with dreams that were yet untouched by the weight of the world. Lately, she had taken to talking about schools she'd heard about on the other side of town, schools with big libraries, gardens, and art rooms. It pained Jonathan to think about how little he could give her, but he was determined to keep working, keep saving, in hopes that one day he could give her the life she deserved. As Jonathan walked to his assigned section, he could feel the familiar weight of eyes on him. Hank, the site's white foreman, stood at a distance, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Jonathan with that same cold, assessing stare that had become all too familiar. Hank was a towering figure, his face set in a perpetual scowl, with a demeanor that suggested he took pleasure in the authority he wielded over the workers, especially those who didn't look like him. He was known for his harsh management style, but when it came to Jonathan, Hank's treatment seemed to border on cruelty. Jonathan took a deep breath, mentally bracing himself for whatever Hank might throw his way today. The foreman had a reputation for singling out the black and Hispanic workers, assigning them the dirtiest, most strenuous tasks. Over the past few months, Jonathan had been sent to work on increasingly dangerous jobs, often alone on high scaffolding or isolated from the rest of the crew. It was clear that Hank had little regard for his well-being. "Hey, Jonathan," Hank's voice boomed across the site, cutting through the clamor. Jonathan turned, keeping his expression neutral as the foreman approached, his boots thudding heavily against the ground. "You got 2 hands, don't you?" Hank sneered, nodding towards a large pile of heavy beams stacked near the edge of the construction zone. "Get those up to the 3rd floor, and don't drag your feet. We're not paying you to stand around." Jonathan nodded silently, accustomed to Hank's belittling tone. He made his way to the pile, his muscles tensing as he prepared to lift. The beams were solid steel, and even one was enough to strain his back. But Hank rarely seemed to assign helpers when Jonathan was involved. The other workers cast glances his way, some sympathetic, others wary, but no one dared to step in. Speaking out could mean losing their job, and jobs were hard to come by. Jonathan bent down, gripped the first beam, and hoisted it onto his shoulder. The weight was immense, but he'd been lifting these burdens for years, and he knew how to channel his strength to avoid injury. He moved steadily, carrying the beam across the site and up a narrow stairwell, all while Hank's eyes bore into his back. By the time he returned for the second load, sweat was pouring down his face, soaking through his shirt. The hours ticked by in the same grueling fashion. Jonathan worked without complaint, determined not to give Hank the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. He focused on each task, pushing aside the fatigue and the faint ache that had begun to settle in his joints. He thought of Mia, her laughter, her bright, eager face, and the promise he had made to her to always keep going. At lunch, Jonathan found a quiet spot on the edge of the site, away from the clamor of the other workers. He unwrapped his sandwich, taking slow bites as he watched the city skyline in the distance. The skyscrapers seemed to glisten in the midday sun, symbols of wealth and ambition far removed from the world he knew. A part of him wondered what it would be like to live in one of those gleaming buildings, to have the luxury of stability and comfort. But he quickly pushed the thought aside. Dreaming too big could be dangerous. It was better to keep his feet on the ground and his mind on his work. As he ate, a few of the men from his team approached, settling nearby with their own lunches. They talked among themselves, occasionally glancing over at Jonathan with a mix of admiration and sympathy. He had become somewhat of a quiet leader among them, a man who carried himself with dignity despite the harsh conditions and the prejudice he faced. "You doing all right, man?" one of his colleagues, Ramon, asked, his brow creased with concern. Jonathan nodded, giving a faint smile. "Same as always. Gotta keep going." Ramon shook his head, casting a glance over his shoulder to where Hank was speaking with another foreman. "That guy has it out for you, you know that?" Jonathan's smile faded. "I know, but I don't have a choice. I can't afford to lose this job. Got my family to think about." The others nodded in agreement, understanding the weight of responsibility that Jonathan bore. For many of them, the job was a lifeline, a chance to provide for their families in a way that was often hard to find elsewhere. They each carried their own burdens, but there was an unspoken respect for Jonathan's resolve, his refusal to let Hank break him. As the men returned to work, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would endure whatever Hank threw his way, not for himself, but for Mia, for the life he wanted her to have. The days blurred together, each one weighed down by an unspoken tension. Jonathan could feel Hank's presence like a shadow, lurking just out of sight, waiting for any chance to make his life harder. It seemed that every small act, every subtle defiance, was a new reason for Hank to find fault. What started as minor provocations, missing breaks, increased workload, quickly escalated into something darker, something that simmered with a kind of malice Jonathan had rarely encountered. But Jonathan knew Hank's scorn wasn't random. It was directed, intentional, and it made him question if there was more behind the foreman's actions than simple dislike. Hank's disdain was sharp, cutting deeper than a mere bad temperament. Jonathan suspected Hank had something against men like him, those who were trying to make a life in an unforgiving city where the color of your skin could mean the difference between opportunity and hardship. Hank had a past. That much was clear from the man's hardened expressions, the way he moved with a swagger that spoke of violence restrained only by thin threads of civility. Rumors floated around the site. Hank had grown up in a rough neighborhood, had his fair share of trouble, and only managed to claw his way up the ladder through a mixture of brute force and ruthlessness. The The story went that he had once been a heavy drinker, prone to brawling and street fights. Jonathan had seen men like him before, men who wore their scars like badges, as if the world owed them something for the struggles they had endured. It was clear that Hank saw himself as a man who had earned his place, a place he wasn't willing to share or respect in others. In his mind, respect was a privilege, not a given, and certainly not something he intended to extend to Jonathan. For Hank, Jonathan's hard work was a reminder of a competition he'd rather not acknowledge. One evening, as Jonathan sat at home, his wife noticed the exhaustion etched across his face, the tension in his shoulders. She could tell that work had been more demanding than usual. She was used to seeing him tired, but lately there was a heaviness to him, a sense of strain that didn't fade with rest. "What's wrong?" she asked gently, her hand reaching across the table to cover his. Her touch was warm, grounding him. He shook his head, trying to muster a smile. "Nothing I can't handle." She held his gaze, not letting him evade her concern. "It's more than just the work, isn't it?" Jonathan sighed, his eyes drifting to the small, cluttered kitchen, the chipped paint on the walls, the frayed edges of the carpet. All around him were reminders of why he couldn't just leave, why he had to endure. Every inch of this apartment was tied to a promise, the promise of a better life, a life where Mia could grow up with more than he'd ever had. "There's this man," he began slowly, struggling to put his thoughts into words. "My foreman. He doesn't like me much. Every day it's something new. I try to ignore it, but it's getting harder." His wife frowned, worry etching lines into her face. "Can't you report him? There must be someone who can help." Jonathan shook his head. "It's not that simple. He's been there longer than I have. They'd take his word over mine." Her grip on his hand tightened. "Jonathan, I don't want you to keep putting up with this. It's not worth it." He wished he could agree, but he knew what was at stake. "I know, but we need this job. Mia needs it. I can't walk away now. I have to hold on." In that moment, he felt the weight of his responsibilities more than ever. They had no safety net, no backup plan if things went wrong. The job was all they had, a fragile lifeline that kept them afloat. To lose it now would mean starting over, and he couldn't bear to see his family go through that. As days passed, Hank's treatment of him worsened. The foreman began assigning him tasks that were nearly impossible to complete alone. One morning, Jonathan found himself carrying bags of cement up 3 flights of stairs because Hank had forgotten to order an elevator operator. The bags were heavy, each step a grueling test of strength and endurance. By the time he reached the top, his arms burned, his legs ached, and he could feel the strain in every muscle. But it wasn't just the physical toll that wore on him. There was a psychological edge to Hank's actions, a clear intent to push him past his limits, to make him crack under the pressure. Hank's eyes followed him like a predator stalking prey, watching for any sign of weakness, any reason to pounce. During their lunch break, Jonathan found a spot away from the others, trying to gather his strength. His hands shook as he unwrapped his sandwich, his body still recovering from the strain of the morning's tasks. He barely had time to sit down when he heard the familiar sound of Hank's boots on the gravel behind him. "You think you're tough, don't you?" Hank sneered, towering over him. Jonathan didn't look up, keeping his focus on his meal. "Just doing my job, same as everyone else." Hank laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Your job is to do what I tell you, and to do it faster. I'm not running a charity here." Jonathan clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay calm. He knew that rising to Hank's bait would only make things worse, but the foreman's words cut deeper than usual. There was something personal in Hank's tone, something that felt like more than just workplace authority. Hank leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "Men like you think you can just come here and take what isn't yours, but I'll make sure you learn your place, one way or another." Jonathan held his breath, his fists tightening at his sides. He wanted to fight back, to stand up and tell Hank exactly what he thought of him, but the stakes were too high. If he lost this job, he would lose everything he had worked so hard for. And Hank knew that. As the weeks dragged on, Jonathan found himself growing more and more isolated. Hank's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by his colleagues, but they were all too afraid to intervene. The fear of becoming Hank's next target was enough to keep them silent. Jonathan's only support came from the quiet nods of encouragement from a few sympathetic co-workers, small gestures that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. Yet, each day became a new test of his endurance, a fresh challenge to his resilience. There were times when he would lie awake at night, wondering if he should walk away, if it was worth enduring Hank's abuse for the sake of his family's future. But every time he came to the same conclusion. He had no other choice. This job was his only chance to give Mia the life she deserved. One evening, as he sat on the worn sofa in their cramped living room, Mia climbed onto his lap, her small hands clutching a picture she had drawn. She held it up proudly, her eyes shining with excitement. "Look, Daddy, I drew our new house." Jonathan's heart twisted as he took the paper from her. She had drawn a 2-story house with a big yard, a tree, and flowers lining the path to the front door. It was the kind of home he had always dreamed of, the kind he wanted her to have. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "One day we'll have a house just like that." Mia's face lit up, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Promise?" He hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of that promise settle heavily on his shoulders. "I promise." In that moment, he felt a renewed sense of determination. No matter how difficult things became, he would endure. He would keep going, keep pushing for her, for the chance to give her a life that was better than his own. The next morning, as he prepared for another day on the site, he could feel the tension building inside him, a silent storm waiting to break. Hank's words from the previous day echoed in his mind, a dark reminder of the battles he still had to face. But as Jonathan stood at the edge of the construction zone, the towering steel beam stretching into the sky above him, he took a deep breath and steadied himself. He would face whatever came his way, for Mia, for his family, and for the promise he had made. No one, not even Hank, would take that from him. Tension hung heavy in the air. Every day, Hank's presence loomed closer, more palpable, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. It was more than intimidation now. It was an outright campaign to break Jonathan. The sneers, the tasks assigned to him, and the hostile glares felt more focused, more deliberate. Jonathan had the sense that Hank was waiting for him to snap, to lose control, and it was getting harder to resist. The moments alone at night had become his only respite, but even then he couldn't escape the anxiety that had wormed its way into his life. The cramped apartment felt smaller, more oppressive, especially when he thought of what lay ahead the next day. Sometimes he wondered what his life would be like if he didn't have to face Hank's relentless cruelty. But that was a fantasy, a fleeting glimpse of what could be. The reality was that he had little choice but to endure. Hank's hostility took on new forms. If Jonathan was working on a scaffold, Hank would suddenly be nearby, shouting instructions that forced Jonathan to adjust his footing or lean over the edge. During tasks that required multiple hands, Hank deliberately left him alone, ignoring his requests for assistance. Each day, he was isolated, his role made intentionally harder. One morning, Hank assigned Jonathan to an area high above the ground. He handed him the task with a smug grin, saying, "Think you can handle it, or should I get someone stronger?" Jonathan kept his voice calm, but his fists tightened at his sides. "I can handle it." "Good," Hank sneered, turning to leave but pausing long enough to add, "You'd better not disappoint. We don't have room for dead weight here." The words stung. Jonathan could feel the anger bubbling up, but he pushed it down, forcing himself to remain calm. As he climbed the stairs to his workstation, he thought of Mia, of her drawings and her dreams of a better life. She was his anchor, his reason to keep going. No matter what Hank said, no matter how much he tried to undermine him, Jonathan reminded himself that he was doing this for her. By lunchtime, Jonathan was exhausted. His arms ached from carrying heavy materials alone, and his head throbbed from the intense focus required to balance on narrow beams without support. As he sat alone, eating his sandwich, he noticed a few of his co-workers glancing in his direction. Some of them nodded, a silent show of solidarity, but none dared to approach. Hank had made it clear that associating with Jonathan would bring its own consequences. Ramon, one of the few who hadn't completely distanced himself, caught his eye and offered a weak smile. Ramon knew what it was like to be targeted. He'd had his share of run-ins with Hank in the past. The unspoken understanding between them offered Jonathan some comfort, even if it was only temporary. After lunch, Jonathan returned to his post. Hank was there as usual, watching him from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest. There was a look in his eyes that made Jonathan uneasy, a glint of something dark and malicious. It was as if Hank was daring him to fail, to make one wrong move so he could swoop in and deliver the final blow. And then it happened. As Jonathan was adjusting a heavy beam on the upper level, Hank appeared out of nowhere, standing just a few feet away, his presence more intrusive than ever. Jonathan glanced at him, his hands gripping the beam tightly, his muscles strained from the weight. "What are you looking at?" Hank snapped, his voice cold. "Just doing my job," Jonathan replied, keeping his tone neutral. Hank smirked. "Is that so? Looks to me like you're struggling. Maybe you're not cut out for this after all." Jonathan's patience was wearing thin. He wanted to tell Hank exactly what he thought of him, to let the man know that he wouldn't be intimidated, but he held his tongue, knowing that one wrong word could cost him everything. Hank moved closer, his gaze fixed on Jonathan with a dangerous intensity. "Men like you don't belong here. You're just taking up space, pretending to be something you're not, but we both know you're not going to last." Jonathan felt a surge of anger, his hands gripping the beam so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to speak, to tell Hank to back off, but his voice caught in his throat. The weight of Hank's words hung heavy in the air, a poison that seeped into his mind, filling him with doubt. And then, in a sudden movement that felt almost surreal, Hank reached out and gave Jonathan a hard shove. The world tilted, and before Jonathan could react, he was falling, the ground rushing up to meet him. For a split second, he felt weightless, suspended in a terrifying freefall. His mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and disbelief. He could see the ground below, the piles of rubble and debris that seemed to grow closer with each passing second. He thought of Mia, of her laughter and her dreams, and a deep, aching sorrow filled his chest. He had promised her a better life, a life where she wouldn't have to struggle the way he had. But now, that promise was slipping through his fingers, disappearing into the void. The impact came suddenly, a jarring collision that sent a shock wave of pain through his body. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, his lungs burning as he struggled to take in air. The world around him was a blur, the sounds muffled and distant. He was vaguely aware of voices, of people shouting, but everything felt hazy, as if he were trapped in a dream. Gradually, his vision cleared, and he realized that he was lying in a pile of soft, discarded insulation materials. It was a miracle that he had landed here, that he hadn't been crushed by the rubble below. But even as he tried to process what had happened, the pain in his body grew sharper, a reminder of just how close he had come to losing everything. The paramedics arrived within minutes, carefully lifting him onto a stretcher. He could hear their voices, calm and reassuring, as they checked his vitals and prepared him for transport. Through the haze of pain, he managed to focus on one of the paramedics, a young woman with a kind face who spoke to him in a soothing tone. "You're going to be okay," she said, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "We're taking you to the hospital. Just hold on." Jonathan nodded weakly, his mind still reeling from the shock. As the ambulance doors closed behind him, he thought of Hank, of the man's cold, calculating gaze as he'd pushed him over the edge. It had been intentional. There was no doubt about that. Hank had tried to kill him. In the sterile quiet of the hospital, Jonathan lay on the bed, his body covered in bruises and cuts, his limbs heavy with fatigue. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a tangled mess of fear and anger. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Hank's face, the smirk that had haunted him for months, now more sinister than ever. When he awoke, he found his wife sitting beside him, her eyes red from crying. She took his hand, her fingers warm and comforting, a lifeline in the midst of his pain. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The doctors say you're going to be okay." Jonathan squeezed her hand, his own trembling slightly. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was hold on to her, letting her presence ground him in the reality of the moment. A police officer entered the room a short time later, his expression serious as he introduced himself. "Mr. Johnson, we understand there was an incident at your workplace. Can you tell us what happened?" Jonathan hesitated, his mind racing as he thought of Hank, of the months of abuse and hostility he had endured. He knew that speaking out could bring consequences, that he could be putting himself at risk. But as he looked into the officer's eyes, he felt a spark of determination, a flicker of the courage he had nearly lost. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. "It wasn't an accident. My foreman, he pushed me." The officer nodded, his expression grim as he took notes. "We'll need to investigate further, but we'll make sure you get the justice you deserve." As the officer left, Jonathan felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had finally spoken out, had taken the first step toward standing up for himself. And as he lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines, he made a promise to himself. He would fight back, not just for himself, but for Mia, for the future he had promised her. The following days in the hospital passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Jonathan lay in his bed, his body bruised and broken, each movement sending sharp jolts of agony through him. But beneath the physical pain, there was another kind of ache, a simmering rage that refused to fade. He replayed the moment of the fall over and over in his mind, the sickening lurch as Hank had shoved him, the terrifying realization that he was plummeting towards the ground, and the haunting certainty that Hank had intended for him not to survive. The nurses came and went, bringing medications and changing his bandages, their voices kind and reassuring. But even their efforts couldn't soothe the turmoil inside him. He had always known that Hank despised him, that the man held him in contempt, but this was something darker, something he hadn't fully grasped until he lay here, a prisoner in his own broken body. One afternoon, as he lay staring at the ceiling, lost in thought, a gentle knock sounded at the door. He looked up, his heart lifting as he saw his wife and daughter entering the room. Mia, clutching a drawing in her small hands, beamed as she rushed to his bedside. Her innocent joy was a balm to his soul, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. "Daddy!" she cried, climbing onto the edge of the bed and showing him her picture. "Look, I made this for you." Jonathan managed a smile, his eyes misting as he looked at the drawing. It was a picture of their family, standing in front of the house Mia had always dreamed of. In the drawing, he looked strong and healthy, his arm around his wife, his other hand holding Mia's. It was a perfect world, a world he wanted to give her. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. "I'm going to keep this forever." His wife moved to his other side, taking his hand in hers, her touch soft but steady. "The police were here earlier," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of relief and fear. "They said they're investigating what happened." Jonathan nodded, his mind flashing back to the officer's visit. He had told them everything, sparing no detail, his voice steady even as the memories stirred a whirlwind of emotions within him. He knew that his words could set something in motion, a series of events that would bring Hank's actions into the light. But even as he took comfort in the thought of justice, a part of him remained wary, uncertain. He knew the system wasn't always fair, that people like Hank often slipped through the cracks, their misdeeds going unpunished. It was a bitter truth, one he had learned through years of watching men like Hank rise to positions of power, while those who struggled, those who worked honestly, were left behind. "Are you sure you're okay to do this?" his wife asked, her eyes filled with concern. "You don't have to go through with it if it's too much." Jonathan looked at her, his resolve hardening. "I have to. It's not just about me. It's about everyone he's ever treated like this. He needs to be held accountable." She nodded, her grip tightening. "Then I'm with you. We'll get through this together." Over the next few days, as he regained some strength, Jonathan received more visits from his co-workers. Ramon came by, his face a mixture of relief and anger as he recounted the rumors spreading around the construction site. Word of Hank's actions had already begun to circulate, and the workers were speaking out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment, the ways Hank had pushed them to their limits, belittled them, made their lives miserable. "You're not alone in this, man," Ramon said, his voice thick with emotion. "A lot of us have seen what he's done. And now, maybe we'll finally see him pay for it." The support of his coworkers filled Jonathan with a newfound strength, a sense of solidarity he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if his fall had broken something open, revealing truths that had been hidden for too long. Hank's cruelty was no longer a secret, and the workers were no longer afraid to speak up. As the investigation continued, Jonathan received regular updates from the police. They had gathered testimonies from several witnesses, Workers who had seen Hank's treatment of him, who had witnessed the bullying and hostility that had led up to the fall. Their accounts painted a clear picture of a man who wielded his authority like a weapon, who took pleasure in exerting control over those he deemed beneath him. The day came when Jonathan was discharged from the hospital, his injuries still healing but his spirit unbroken. His wife helped him into the car, her hands gentle but firm, her presence a steadying force as they made their way home. As they pulled up to their apartment, he felt a surge of gratitude for her strength, her unwavering support. She had been his rock, his anchor through the darkest of days. Inside, Mia greeted him with a cheer, her joy infectious as she wrapped her arms around him. She didn't understand the full extent of what had happened, but she sensed that her father had been through something difficult, something that had tested him in ways she couldn't fully grasp. Over the following weeks, Jonathan worked on his recovery, attending physical therapy sessions and slowly rebuilding his strength. His body ached, his movements slow and cautious, but with each passing day he grew stronger, more determined. The image of Mia's drawing stayed with him, a reminder of the life he was fighting for, the future he wanted to build. And then, one day, a letter arrived. It was from the construction company, an official document informing him that he was being offered a promotion. The news took him by surprise, a mix of emotions swirling within him as he read the letter. The position was a step up, a recognition of his hard work and dedication, but he knew that it was also a response to the investigation, a way for the company to save face, to make amends for what had happened. Still, he couldn't deny the opportunity it presented, the chance to provide more for his family, to finally give Mia the stability she deserved. He accepted the promotion, grateful for the change, but aware of the battles that had brought him here. Returning to the construction site for the first time since the accident was a strange experience. The workers greeted him with nods and handshakes, their respect palpable as they welcomed him back. There was a sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding of what he had endured, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose as he stepped into his new role. With Hank gone and the workers no longer under the shadow of his cruelty, the atmosphere on the site had shifted. Jonathan took pride in his work and the respect he earned from his peers, and he made a point of treating his team with fairness and dignity. He had been through the darkness, had faced the worst that the world could throw at him, and had emerged stronger, more resilient. But even as he moved forward, there were moments when he couldn't shake the memories of the fall, the haunting image of Hank's face as he had pushed him over the edge. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, a reminder of the battle he had fought and the justice he had sought. One evening, as he sat at home with his family, Mia climbed onto his lap, her small hands reaching for his. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with innocence and trust, and he felt a surge of love so powerful it took his breath away. "Are you okay now, Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft. He smiled, brushing a hand through her hair. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm okay." She nodded, satisfied, and nestled against him, her presence a balm to his soul. In that moment, he knew that he had done the right thing, that he had fought for her, for the life he wanted to give her, for the promise he had made. And as he held her close, he felt a quiet peace settle over him, a sense of closure that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The day of the trial dawned bright and clear, but for Jonathan, the sunlight felt cold and distant. He sat outside the courthouse with his wife, their hands tightly clasped together as they waited for his case to be called. The weeks of preparation, the police interviews, and the countless replays of the incident in his mind had brought him to this moment, a moment that held the potential to define the rest of his life. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Jonathan could feel his heart racing as they took their seats, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had waited months for this, had endured countless sleepless nights and restless days, all for the chance to finally speak his truth, to tell the world what Hank had done, to ensure that the man who had nearly destroyed him would face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, his gavel striking down with a sense of finality that sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. Across the aisle sat Hank, his expression stony and defiant, as though he were immune to the consequences he faced. The sight of him stirred a dark anger within Jonathan, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on the task ahead. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about standing up for himself and for the others who had suffered under Hank's cruelty. The prosecution called its first witness, a co-worker from the construction site who had witnessed Hank's bullying behavior in the months leading up to the incident. The man spoke quietly but clearly, recounting instances where Hank had singled Jonathan out, assigning him the most dangerous tasks, mocking him in front of others, pushing him to the breaking point. As he spoke, Jonathan could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, a mixture of sympathy and shock at the treatment he had endured. The next witness was Ramon, one of Jonathan's closest allies on the site. Ramon's voice shook slightly as he described the events of the day of the fall, his words painting a vivid picture of the moments leading up to the incident. He told the court how he had seen Hank standing close to Jonathan, how there had been something in Hank's posture, a cold calculation that made the events that followed feel deliberate, intentional. "When I saw him standing there," Ramon said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I knew something was wrong. The way he looked at Jonathan, it wasn't right. And then he just pushed him." The prosecutor's questions were sharp, probing, drawing out every detail, every moment of fear and uncertainty that Ramon had felt. By the time he finished his testimony, there wasn't a person in the room who doubted the malicious intent behind Hank's actions. Jonathan's wife squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with a fierce pride that gave him strength. Finally, it was Jonathan's turn to take the stand. He walked slowly to the witness chair, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he sat down, he took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, steadying his resolve. The prosecutor approached him with a respectful nod, her eyes filled with encouragement. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice calm and measured, "can you tell us, in your own words, what happened on the day of the fall?" Jonathan looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts before meeting her gaze. He felt the weight of everyone's attention, the anticipation that filled the room as he prepared to speak. "It started like any other day," he said, his voice steady. "But there was something different about Hank that morning. He was more intense, more focused on me than usual. I could feel it." He recounted the events leading up to the fall, his words clear and unwavering. He spoke of Hank's mocking words, his attempts to undermine him, the way he had stood close, too close, just before the fall. The courtroom was silent as he described the sensation of falling, the helplessness, the terror, and the realization that he might not survive. "It wasn't an accident," Jonathan said, his voice hardening. "He pushed me. He wanted me to fall." The judge listened intently, his gaze unwavering as he considered Jonathan's words. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied, before turning to the defense attorney, who rose to begin his cross-examination. Jonathan braced himself, knowing that this was the moment he would have to hold firm to keep his composure in the face of doubt and scrutiny. The defense attorney's questions were sharp, designed to sow doubt, to paint Hank's actions as an unfortunate accident rather than an intentional act. He questioned Jonathan's memory, suggested that the fall could have been caused by a slip, a moment of inattention, but Jonathan held his ground, his answers calm and unwavering, refusing to let the attorney shake his resolve. As the trial continued, Jonathan found himself reliving every painful moment of the incident, the memories raw and vivid. But, through it all, he remained strong, bolstered by the presence of his wife and daughter, by the knowledge that he was standing up not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as he had. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. Jonathan's heart pounded as he waited, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He could feel his wife's hand on his shoulder, a steadying presence that reminded him of everything he had fought for. The judge's voice was firm as he read the verdict, his words carrying a weight that filled the room. The court finds the defendant guilty of assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a murmur of approval from those who had gathered to support Jonathan. He felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders as the reality of the verdict sank in. Hank would face the consequences of his actions. Justice had been served. As the guards led Hank away, he cast one last defiant look at Jonathan, his eyes filled with resentment. But Jonathan met his gaze calmly, unshaken. He had won, not through violence or revenge, but through courage and truth. He had stood up for himself, had fought for his family, and he had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer, brighter. Jonathan breathed in the fresh air, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in months. His wife and daughter were waiting for him, their faces filled with pride and love. Mia ran to him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist as she looked up at him with a smile that was pure and unfiltered. "Are you okay now, Daddy?" He knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm okay. We're all okay." His wife took his hand, her eyes glistening with tears of relief. "You did it, Jonathan. You stood up to him." He nodded, his voice filled with quiet pride. "I did. And I'd do it again if I had to." They walked home together, their steps lighter, their hearts unburdened. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt a sense of closure, a peace that came from knowing that justice had been served, that the darkness that had haunted him was finally behind him. In the days that followed, Jonathan returned to work, now free from Hank's oppressive presence. The construction site felt different, lighter, as though a dark cloud had lifted. His co-workers greeted him with respect, their nods and smiles a silent acknowledgement of the strength he had shown. With his promotion, Jonathan was able to provide more for his family, to give Mia the stability and security he had always dreamed of. Their lives were far from perfect, but they were free from fear, from the shadow of a man who had tried to tear him down. As he stood on the site, looking out at the city skyline, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond his job, beyond his role as a worker. He had faced his fears, had fought for what was right, and he had emerged stronger. And for the first time he felt truly hopeful, a hope that promised a future filled with possibilities. The weeks after the trial were a strange blend of relief and adjustment for Jonathan. He had walked out of the courthouse a free man. The weight of months of fear and pain finally lifted from his shoulders. Hank was gone, held accountable for his actions, and the construction site had taken on a new atmosphere, one of camaraderie and mutual respect. Jonathan's promotion had brought changes too, and he was now viewed as not just a respected colleague, but a leader. His new role meant added responsibilities, but for the first time he felt a sense of security he had never known. His duties as a foreman allowed him to oversee the safety and well-being of his team, a responsibility he took seriously. He knew what it was like to feel vulnerable, to be treated as less than human, and he was determined to create an environment where his co-workers felt respected, valued, and safe. One morning, as Jonathan reviewed the day's assignments, Ramon approached him, his face breaking into a grin. "How's the view from up here?" Ramon teased, nodding towards the office overlooking the site. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "Still the same construction site, just a different angle." Ramon slapped him on the shoulder. "Glad to see someone in charge who actually cares about us. You earned this, Jonathan. Don't ever doubt that." Jonathan's smile faded slightly as he looked out over the site, watching the workers moving about their tasks. He felt a surge of pride, a sense of purpose that was still new and almost foreign. He had fought for this, had faced his worst fears and emerged stronger. And now he had the chance to make a difference, to ensure that others wouldn't go through what he had endured. As the day wore on, he moved through the site, checking in with the crew, making sure everyone had the resources they needed. The men greeted him with nods and smiles, a quiet acknowledgement of the respect they held for him. It was a stark contrast to the days of working under Hank, when fear and resentment had cast a shadow over every interaction. Now there was a sense of unity, a shared commitment to the work and to each other. During a break, Jonathan found himself sitting alone, sipping a cup of coffee as he watched the sun climb higher in the sky. The warmth on his face felt like a balm, a reminder of the light that had finally broken through the darkness. He thought of Mia, of her laughter and the joy she brought into his life. For so long, he had carried the weight of his struggles in silence, but now he could finally breathe, finally look forward to a future free from fear. As he sat lost in thought, he felt a familiar presence beside him. Ramon had joined him, a quiet smile on his face as he took a seat. "You know," Ramon began, his voice thoughtful, "I don't think any of us would be here like this if it weren't for you. You changed things, Jonathan, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Jonathan looked at him, surprise flickering across his face. "I just did what I had to do. For my family, for Mia. I couldn't keep living in fear." Ramon nodded. "Maybe. But it takes courage to stand up like you did, especially when no one else was willing to. You gave us that courage, Jonathan. You reminded us that we don't have to accept being treated like less." The words settled over him, a quiet realization of the impact his actions had had on those around him. He had always thought of his fight as a personal one, a battle for his own dignity and survival, but now he saw that it had been something more, something that had resonated with the people who had watched him, who had silently endured alongside him. When he arrived home that evening, his wife greeted him with a warm hug, her eyes shining with pride. She had been his rock through it all, the steady force that had kept him grounded, and he was grateful beyond words for her support. Mia ran to him, her laughter filling the small apartment as she wrapped her arms around him. "Daddy, guess what?" she said, her face bright with excitement. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling down to her level. She held up a drawing, a picture of a house with a garden and a swing set. "I drew our new house. It has everything we talked about." Jonathan's heart ached with love as he looked at the drawing, the simple lines and colors capturing a world of dreams and promises. He pulled her into a hug, his voice soft with emotion. "It's perfect, Mia. One day, we'll have a house just like that." As they settled down for dinner, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. His family was safe, his job secure, and he had the respect of the men he worked with. It was a life he had fought for, one he had earned through every struggle, every sacrifice. But as the weeks passed, Jonathan began to notice small changes at the site. The men worked with a renewed sense of purpose, their laughter and camaraderie filling the air. There was no longer a shadow over them, no sense of dread in their movements. It was as though the entire site had been transformed, freed from the grip of fear and oppression that had once ruled their days. One day, as he was going through paperwork in the office, he received a letter. It was from the prison where Hank was being held. His name was scrawled across the envelope in an unfamiliar hand, but the return address made it clear who the sender was. Jonathan stared at it, his heart pounding as he debated whether or not to open it. Part of him wanted to tear it up, to ignore whatever words Hank had written. But another part of him, a quieter part, felt the need to see it through. He took a deep breath, breaking the seal and unfolding the letter. The words were simple, written in a neat, controlled script. "Jonathan, I know there's no way to undo what I did to you, no way to make up for the pain I caused. But I wanted you to know that I understand now, that I see how wrong I was. I've had a lot of time to think, to look back on my actions, and I realize now that I was driven by anger, by bitterness that I let consume me. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I hope you can find it in yourself to move on, to live the life you deserve. Hank." Jonathan read the letter twice, his mind processing the words, the confession, the regret that Hank had expressed. He felt a mix of emotions, a strange blend of anger, sorrow, and something else, something that felt like closure. Hank's words didn't erase the past, didn't undo the suffering he had endured, but they offered a kind of peace, a final note that allowed him to close that chapter for good. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, deciding not to dwell on it. Hank's actions had shaped his life in ways that could never be erased, but they no longer held power over him. He had found his strength, had rebuilt his life, and he was determined to move forward. In the days that followed, Jonathan focused on his work, on his family, on the life he had fought to create. He poured himself into his role, guiding his team with patience and respect, ensuring that the site was a place where people could work with dignity and pride. His co-workers looked up to him, saw him as a symbol of resilience, and he took that responsibility seriously, knowing that he was setting an example for them. As the months passed, Jonathan and his family began saving for the house Mia had dreamed of. He watched her grow, watched her laughter fill their home, and he felt a quiet joy, a sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he had given her a life free from fear, a life where she could dream and believe in a future without limits. And as he stood on the construction site, watching the sunrise cast a warm glow over the city, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced the darkness, had walked through the fire, and had emerged stronger. And now he stood on solid ground, a man who had reclaimed his life, his dignity, and his future. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and be sure to check out the other videos on the channel.